Here is a question that sounds like a riddle, but is actually a business plan. What valuable company is nobody building? Sit with that for a moment, because most people cannot answer it, and the reason they cannot answer it is more interesting than the question itself. We are trained, from school onward, to be good at things that already exist. We learn the syllabus. We optimize the essay. We benchmark ourselves against the person sitting next to us, and we call that ambition. Almost every incentive in modern life rewards doing a known thing slightly better than the last person did it. But the world was not built by people doing known things slightly better. It was built by people who did something for the first time. And according to Peter Thiel, the difference between those two activities is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of kind. Copying something that works, taking one thing and making more of it, is going from one to many. Making something that did not exist before is going from 0 to 1. The first is horizontal. The second is vertical. Only one of them is actually creating new value, and it is the harder, lonelier, and less popular of the two. That is the spine of a short, spiky, deliberately provocative book called 0 to 1, and it is why a book barely 200 pages long has irritated and inspired an entire generation of founders. It is not really a manual for building a startup, though it is often sold as one. It is an argument about how progress happens, why it has slowed down, and what kind of person and what kind of company is required to restart it. Some of that argument is brilliant. Some of it is convenient. All of it is worth thinking through carefully, which is what we are going to do together. 0 to 1, Notes on Startups, or How to Build the Future was published in 2014. It is credited to Peter Thiel, the American entrepreneur and investor, co-written with Blake Masters. And the origin story matters because it explains the book's texture. In the spring of 2012, Thiel taught a class at Stanford called CS 183 on startups. Blake Masters was a student in that class. He took notes. Very good notes. He posted them online, and they spread far beyond the lecture hall, the way a great set of lecture notes occasionally does. 0 to 1 is the condensed, edited, updated version of those notes, shaped into a book by the two of them together. This explains a lot about how the book reads. It has the compression of a lecture series. Each chapter takes one idea, sharpens it into a blade, demonstrates it on 2 or 3 examples, and moves on. There is very little hedging. There are almost no case studies in the business school sense, no 40 pages of a company's quarterly history. What you get instead are aphorisms with arguments attached. That is the source of both the book's power and its most common criticism. As for Thiel himself, the credentials behind the argument are not theoretical. He co-founded PayPal and led it through the dot-com crash to a sale to eBay. He was the first outside investor in Facebook. He co-founded Palantir, the data analysis company. He runs a venture firm, Founders Fund, whose informal slogan captured a whole mood of technological disappointment, the complaint that we were promised flying cars and got short text messages instead. He is also, it should be said plainly, one of the more polarizing figures in American public life, and readers bring strong priors to anything with his name on it. The book is worth engaging with on the merits of its arguments, and the arguments are strong enough that you do not have to agree with the man to learn from them. The promotion of the book was itself a small piece of performance art. To launch it, Thiel sent what was, at the time, his first and only tweet, in September of 2014. He did an interview with TechCrunch with Alexia Tsotsis, went on Tim Ferriss's podcast, answered questions in an Ask Me Anything session on Reddit, and appeared on NPR with Wade Goodwin. A man famous for arguing that everyone should think for themselves ran a very well-coordinated media campaign. Make of that what you will. The reception was mostly admiring and occasionally sharp. In The Atlantic, Derek Thompson called it possibly the best business book he had ever read, praising it as a lucid articulation of how capitalism and success actually work in the 21st century economy, and noting how simple it manages to feel, barely 200 pages, clear prose, tightly packed aphorisms. Publishers Weekly was cooler, arguing that while Thiel touches on how to build a successful business, the discussion is too abstract to be of much use to the next Steve Jobs. Timothy B. Lee, writing for Vox in November of 2014, allowed that the book contained genuinely good advice while pushing back on parts of the argument. Hold on to those criticisms. We will return to them because I think both the praise and the objection are correct at the same time. Start with the central distinction because everything else in the book hangs off it. Thiel divides progress into two types. Horizontal progress is copying things that work. Take a technology or a business model that exists in one place and replicate it in 100 more places. Globalization is the master example. If you take a working factory design and build it in a country that does not have one, you have made the world meaningfully better without inventing anything. This is going from one to many. Vertical progress is doing something that has never been done. Not more typewriters, but the first word processor. Not more of a thing, but a new thing. This is going from 0 to 1. And Thiel's claim is that vertical progress is what we actually mean by technology, and that we have, as a civilization, gotten alarmingly bad at it outside of the narrow corridor of software and computing. Why does the distinction matter so much? Because the two kinds of progress feel identical from the inside while producing wildly different outcomes. A company that copies an existing model enters a world where the rules are already known, which means every competitor knows them too. A company that makes something genuinely new gets to write the rules for a while. The copying company is fighting for a slice of a fixed pie. The creating company is baking a pie that did not previously exist. The reason we default to copying is not stupidity. It is that copying is legible. You can explain it to investors, to your parents, to yourself. There is a comparable. There is a market size estimate. Creation, by contrast, is illegible almost by definition. If the thing you are making is genuinely new, then by definition there is no data about whether people want it because they have never seen it. The market research for a product nobody has imagined returns nothing. So the entire apparatus of rational, evidence-based decision-making quietly biases us toward the copy and away from the leap. That bias is the invisible tax on the future. And Thiel's diagnosis is that we have been paying it for decades. Now to the most quoted and most misunderstood claim in the book. Competition is for losers. This lands badly on first hearing because we are raised to believe competition is the engine of excellence. Competition sorts the good from the bad. Competition drives prices down and quality up. And in the aggregate, for consumers, that is largely true. But Thiel is not making a claim about consumer welfare. He is making a claim about what it is like to be inside a competitive business and what happens to your profits when you are. In a perfectly competitive market, economic theory says something brutal. Over time, profits go to zero. Every firm sells an undifferentiated product at a price set by the market. Any advantage gets copied. Any margin gets competed away. Firms survive, but they do not thrive, and they spend all their energy running very hard to stay in the same place. The alternative is a business so distinctive that it has no real substitute. Thiel calls it a monopoly, using the word deliberately to provoke. He does not mean a government-granted cartel or an illegal scheme to crush rivals. He means what he calls a creative monopoly, a company that is the only one doing a particular valuable thing, and that earns extraordinary profits precisely because it is the only one. His illustration of the gap is the comparison between the airline industry and Google. Airlines move enormous numbers of people over enormous distances. The economic value they create is staggering, and civilization would look completely different without them. And yet, as an industry, airlines have historically operated on painfully thin margins because they compete ferociously on a near-commodity service where the customer mostly compares price. Google, by contrast, created a search engine and captured a very large share of the value it generated because for a long time there was nothing that could do what it did nearly as well. The lesson is not that one is virtuous and the other is not. The lesson is that creating value and capturing value are two different problems, and solving only the first one leaves you exhausted and poor. There is a deeper psychological point buried underneath the economics, and I think it is the most valuable thing in the book. Thiel argues that competition is often a form of imitation rather than a form of judgment. We fight hardest over the things we can most easily compare ourselves on, which means we let our rivals set our goals. Two companies locked in a war over the same customers become mirror images of each other, obsessed with each other, drifting further from any independent sense of what they should be building. The fight itself becomes the identity. This is why he says that all happy companies are different, because each has earned its position by solving a unique problem, while all unhappy companies are alike in having failed to escape the sameness of competition. The practical implication is uncomfortable. If you find yourself in a crowded market, the winning move is often not to fight better. It is to leave. If monopoly in this creative sense is the goal, the obvious question is how you get one. Thiel names 4 characteristics that tend to show up in businesses that hold their position. The first is proprietary technology. Not just better technology, but dramatically better. His rule of thumb is that your core technology should be at least 10 times better than the closest substitute on some dimension that matters. 10 times, not 20%. A 20% improvement is an argument you have to make in a sales meeting. A 10 times improvement is self-evident on contact. If you cannot articulate what your 10 times is, you probably do not have one, and you are probably about to compete on price. The second is network effects. A product becomes more valuable to each user as more people use it. This is the strongest moat in existence once established, and the hardest to bootstrap, because in the early days the network is small, and therefore the product is by definition weak. That is why network effect businesses almost always have to begin in a tiny market where a small absolute number of users still constitutes a critical mass. The third is economies of scale. A good business gets structurally stronger as it grows, because its fixed costs spread across more units while its marginal costs stay near zero. Software has this property in its purest form. A service business that must hire one more person for every new customer does not. The fourth is branding. This one comes with a warning attached. A strong brand can be a genuine and durable advantage, but branding cannot be the foundation. Brand is the visible surface of substance. If you begin with the surface, you get a beautifully packaged company with nothing behind it, and the market eventually notices. I would add one observation of my own here. These 4 are not a checklist to satisfy so much as a diagnostic to be honest with yourself about. Most founders can, with enough creativity, construct a story in which they have all 4. The useful exercise is the opposite. Try to argue that you have none of them, and see how hard it is. If it is easy to argue you have none, listen to that. The strategy Thiel recommends is counterintuitive to anyone who has ever written a business plan with a slide about $1 trillion addressable market. Start absurdly small. Find a market so narrow that you can plausibly dominate it, and dominate it. Not a 1% slice of an enormous market, but a very large share of a market small enough that most people would not bother to name it. Owning a small market completely is a real position. Holding a sliver of a huge market is a rounding error that will be erased by the first serious competitor. His canonical example is the origin of the online marketplace that began with collectible toys, and the payments company that began by serving a few thousand power sellers on an auction site rather than trying to replace banking for everyone at once. Small does not mean unambitious. Small is the beachhead. What matters is that from your small dominated market, there are adjacent markets you can expand into by concentric circles, each one a little larger, each one entered from a position of strength rather than from nothing. He also warns against the word disruption, which he thinks has been degraded into a pose. Framing yourself as the disruptor of a giant incumbent is a way of defining yourself relative to that incumbent, which drags you back into the imitative competition you were trying to escape, and additionally guarantees that a very large, very well-resourced enemy is now paying attention to you. Creating something new that nobody was doing is quieter and better. And then there is the idea I find most freeing in the whole book, last mover advantage. We are told obsessively about first mover advantage, about the value of being early. Thiel points out that being first is only useful if you are still standing at the end. Being first is a tactic, not a goal. The goal is to make the last great development in a specific market and then enjoy years, ideally decades, of the profits that follow. The relevant question about a business is not how fast it grew last quarter. It is whether it will still exist and still be dominant in 10 years. Most of the value of a great company sits far out in the future, which means durability, not velocity, is the thing to underwrite. One of the most interesting chapters has almost nothing to do with startups. It is about how societies think about the future, and it uses a simple 2x2. You can be optimistic or pessimistic about the future, and you can be definite or indefinite about it. Definite means you have a specific picture of what the future looks like and a plan to get there. Indefinite means you think the future is fundamentally unknowable, so the right posture is to keep options open and stay flexible. Definite optimism believes the future will be better and that specific people must build specific things to make it so. Thiel associates this with the mid-20th century United States, the era of enormous concrete plans, the interstate highway system, the Apollo program, vast infrastructure conceived and executed on multi-decade timelines. Indefinite optimism believes the future will be better, but has no idea how, so it does not plan. It diversifies, it hedges, it keeps optionality. Definite pessimism knows the future will be worse and plans carefully for it. Indefinite pessimism sees decline coming and does not know what to do, so it does nothing much at all. Thiel's argument is that the developed world, and particularly America, drifted from definite optimism into indefinite optimism somewhere around the early 1980s, and that this drift explains a great deal of what feels stagnant. An indefinitely optimistic society produces a distinctive culture. It prizes generalists over specialists, process over product, finance over engineering. Finance in particular becomes the dominant discipline, because finance is what you do with money when you do not know what to build with it. You move it around, you hedge it, you optimize its allocation among things other people have already built. The same pattern shows up at the level of the individual life. An indefinitely optimistic person keeps their options open, the well-rounded resume, the credential that is useful in many possible futures, the refusal to commit to any one path in case a better one appears. It feels prudent. It is also, Thiel argues, a way of guaranteeing you will never do anything only you could have done. The definite version of a life is worse insured and vastly more likely to matter. I think this chapter is the most quietly radical part of the book, because it reframes planning not as a management technique but as a moral stance. To make a definite plan is to claim that the future is something you can affect. To refuse to plan is to treat the future as weather. Then comes the piece of the book that changed how a lot of people think about risk and attention. Venture capital, on its surface, looks like a portfolio game. You make many bets, most fail, some work, and you hope the winners cover the losers. What Thiel points out is that the distribution is far more extreme than that framing suggests. In a successful venture fund, the single best investment typically returns as much as or more than the entire rest of the fund combined. The second best returns about as much as everything except the first. It is not a normal distribution with a fat tail. It is a power law, where a tiny number of outcomes account for nearly all the value. This has a consequence that most investors say they understand and then fail to act on. If the power law is real, then diversification as a strategy is close to self-defeating, because spreading yourself thin guarantees that your small position in the one enormous winner will not be enough to matter. The correct move is the uncomfortable one. Only pursue things that could plausibly be enormous, and then concentrate. But the deeper application is not about investing at all. It is about life. Thiel argues that the power law governs far more than portfolios. A small number of decisions, relationships, and periods of work generate the overwhelming majority of the outcomes in a career. Which means the question is not how to be efficient across many things. It is how to identify the very few things worth being excellent at and then decline almost everything else. This runs directly against the diversification instinct we are all trained into. Keep several options alive. Build a broad base. Do not put all your eggs in one basket. That advice is well suited to a world of normally distributed outcomes. In a power law world, it produces a life of many baskets, none of which contains anything remarkable. There is real risk in concentration, and Thiel is somewhat cavalier about the people for whom the concentrated bet does not pay off. But the underlying observation stands, and I do not think most people have absorbed it. Underneath the business advice sits a philosophical claim. There are still secrets, and most people no longer believe that. A secret, in this book's vocabulary, is something important and true that is hard to discover, but not impossible. It sits between the conventional, which everyone already knows, and the genuinely impossible, which nobody can know. Every great company, Thiel argues, is built on a secret, a piece of knowledge about the world that the founders had and the rest of the market did not. He divides them into two kinds. There are secrets of nature, which come from studying the physical world and finding something in it that nobody had noticed. And there are secrets about people, which are things people do not know about themselves, or things they know and actively hide. The second category is enormously underexplored, and it is where most business secrets live. What are people not allowed to talk about? What is everyone quietly doing that no product serves? What do people say they want versus what they actually do? But the reason this chapter matters is the cultural diagnosis attached to it. Thiel argues we have slid into a widespread belief that there is nothing important left to find. Every frontier has been mapped, every field professionalized, every discovery already made by someone with better credentials. Once you believe that, you stop looking, and the belief becomes self-fulfilling. A world convinced there are no secrets left will stop producing the searchers who would find them. That framing is generous to anyone who feels late to everything. If secrets exist, then the fact that a field looks fully explored is evidence about the state of attention, not about the state of the world. The most valuable question you can carry around is his contrarian one. What important truth do very few people agree with you on? A good answer will feel socially uncomfortable to say out loud, which is exactly the signal that it might be a secret rather than a slogan. 3 practical chapters deserve to be taken together because they share a theme, the things that quietly decide a company's fate long before the market does. The first is foundations. Thiel states his rule bluntly: a startup broken at its foundation cannot be fixed later. Early decisions about who your co-founders are, how ownership is split, who sits on the board, and what the company is actually for become load-bearing walls, and you cannot renovate a load-bearing wall while the building is occupied. He recommends knowing your co-founders well before starting, because a co-founder relationship is closer to a marriage than to a hire and has a similar failure mode. He recommends small boards, because a board of 3 can actually govern while a board of a dozen becomes theater. And he makes the striking argument that a lower cash salary for a chief executive at an early-stage company correlates with better outcomes, floating a number in the neighborhood of $150,000 a year as a ceiling worth noticing. The logic is that cash pays you for the present while equity pays you for the future, and you want the person at the top oriented entirely toward the future. The second is culture. Thiel's version of this is deliberately extreme. The best startups resemble cults, in that they are bound by a shared conviction that outsiders find slightly strange, and that the difference between a cult and a great company is whether the shared conviction happens to be true. The practical version is less alarming than it sounds. Hire people who would want to work with each other regardless of pay. Give everyone a distinct, well-defined responsibility so that internal competition has nothing to feed on. Make the mission specific enough that it can attract some people by repelling others. The alumni network that came out of PayPal, which went on to found an implausible number of significant companies, is the evidence he points to. The third, and the one most founders resist, is sales. Thiel's claim is that if you have invented something new but have not invented a way to sell it, you have a bad business, full stop. Engineers in particular resist this because they want to believe a sufficiently good product sells itself, and that belief is comforting and false. What makes the chapter useful is that he treats distribution as an engineering problem with a structure. The right sales method depends almost entirely on the size of the transaction. Enormous deals require complex, personal, multi-year selling led by the chief executive. Mid-sized deals support a conventional sales force. Very small transactions require marketing and advertising at scale, or genuine virality where using the product recruits the next user. And there is a dead zone in the middle, where the deal is too small to justify a salesperson's time and too large to move through advertising. Many companies die in that zone without ever understanding what killed them. The final point is the one to remember. Sales works best when it is invisible, and everybody in a company sells, whether or not they have the title. 2 more threads round out the argument. The first is the relationship between people and computers. Thiel pushes back hard on the framing of artificial intelligence as a substitute for human labor, arguing instead that the enormous opportunity lies in complementarity. Computers are extraordinary at processing volume and finding patterns at scales no person can hold. Humans are extraordinary at judgment, intention, and knowing which questions matter. Systems that pair the two beat either alone. The example from his own history is fraud detection at PayPal, where purely automated systems were outmaneuvered by adaptive criminals and purely human review could not scale. And the solution was a hybrid in which software flagged suspicious patterns for human analysts to judge. Palantir was built on the same premise. Whatever one thinks of that company's applications, the underlying design thesis has aged well, and it is a useful corrective to a decade of conversation that treats automation as a simple replacement. The second is his autopsy of the clean technology bubble of the mid-2000s, which produced spectacular failures despite enormous capital and genuine urgency. Out of that wreckage, he extracts 7 questions that every business must answer. Can you create breakthrough technology rather than incremental improvement? Is now the right time to start this particular business? Are you starting with a big share of a small market? Do you have the right people? Do you have a way not just to make your product but to deliver it? Will your market position be defensible 10 and 20 years into the future? And have you identified a unique opportunity that others do not see? The framework's value is in the scoring. Thiel's claim is that you do not need to ace all 7, but that companies failing most of them fail, and that the clean technology companies of that era typically had a compelling story on 1 or 2 while quietly failing the rest. Tesla is the counterexample he offers, a company that had a plausible answer to all 7 at once. Whatever you think of that verdict a decade later, the discipline of forcing yourself to answer all 7 honestly, in writing, is the single most portable tool in the book. Let me gather what I think actually survives. The distinction between 0 to 1 and 1 to many is the most useful mental category here. Before starting anything, ask which one you are doing. Both are legitimate. Only one of them creates something that did not exist, and only one of them earns you a position that competition cannot immediately erode. Being clear-eyed about which game you have entered prevents you from expecting monopoly returns from a copying business. Competition is not automatically virtuous, and the fight you are in may have been chosen for you by imitation rather than by judgment. When you notice yourself defining success relative to a specific rival, treat that as a warning light. The most valuable move in a crowded market is frequently to find an adjacent, uncrowded one. Value creation and value capture are separate problems. Solving only the first makes you useful and poor. Ask specifically what mechanism lets your business keep a share of the value it creates, and if the honest answer is nothing, you have a project, not a company. Start smaller than feels ambitious. A dominated niche is a real asset. A 1% share of an enormous market is a story, not a position. Expand outward in concentric circles from a place of strength. The power law means a small number of things account for nearly all outcomes. This should change how you allocate not just capital but attention. Pursue only what could plausibly matter enormously, then concentrate rather than hedge. Definite beats indefinite. Having a specific plan you might be wrong about beats having flexible optionality you will never cash in. This applies to companies and to lives. There are still secrets. The belief that everything important has been discovered is a cultural mood, not a fact about the world, and treating it as a fact is how you guarantee you never find anything. Foundations are permanent. Co-founders, equity, board, and mission are decided early and cannot be meaningfully revised later. Spend disproportionate care there. And distribution is as much of an invention problem as the product is. If you have not designed how the thing reaches people, you have built half a business. Now the honest accounting, because a summary that only sells the book is not worth much. The criticism from Publishers Weekly is fair. 0 to 1 is abstract. It gives you a lens, not a procedure. If you are looking for a step-by-step guide to your Tuesday, this is not that book, and reading it can produce a pleasant sensation of insight that does not convert into a single concrete action. The counterargument is that the lens is genuinely load-bearing and that most operationally detailed startup books are describing the surface of a specific moment that has already passed. The deeper objection, which Timothy B. Lee raised in Vox and which others have pressed harder since, is that the monopoly argument reads very differently depending on where you are standing. From inside a company, a durable position that competition cannot erode is a beautiful thing. From the outside, from the position of a customer or a smaller rival or a worker, the same structure can look considerably less benign. And the intervening decade has given us plenty of opportunity to observe what entrenched technology monopolies do with entrenchment. Thiel largely elides that tension by defining creative monopolies as the good kind and moving on. That is a rhetorical move, not an argument, and readers should notice it. There is also a survivorship problem running underneath the whole thing. The book generalizes from an extraordinarily successful career during an extraordinarily favorable period for a specific kind of company. The advice to concentrate rather than hedge, to commit definitely rather than keep options open, is excellent advice conditional on being right. It is ruinous advice conditional on being wrong, and the book spends very little time with the people for whom it went wrong. And yet, what 0 to 1 does better than almost anything else in its genre is attack the reflex to imitate. That reflex is nearly invisible because it is universal. We benchmark, we compare, we compete over the things that are easiest to compare, and we mistake the resulting exhaustion for effort. The book's most durable gift is a small set of questions that interrupt that reflex. What important truth do very few people agree with you on? What valuable company is nobody building? What are you doing that only you could do? You do not have to found a startup to use them. They work on a career, a research direction, a piece of writing, a life. The claim underneath all of it is that the future is not a forecast to be estimated, but a thing that specific people build on purpose, and that the number of people willing to try is smaller than it should be. The last thing Thiel leaves you with is a warning against thinking the path forward is a formula at all. There is no template for going from 0 to 1, because a template is by definition something that already exists. Whatever the new thing is, it will have to be found in a place nobody has thought to look, by someone willing to be wrong in public for a while. That is uncomfortable. It is also, if the argument holds, the only way anything genuinely new has ever arrived.